are, by nature, explorers. The same curiosity that sends us to the stars at the speed of thought urges us to go there in reality. And whenever we make a great new leap, we elevate humanity, bring people and nations together, usher in new discoveries and new technologies. So remember to look up at the stars and not down at your feet.
Brilliant. Okay, guys, I'm going to get started now. The talk's going to be about 45 minutes. I'll get through it as efficiently as I can, but I'm just going to talk about the different topics that we're going to cover. It is a beginner's talk, so if you're looking for tips on using webcams or really advanced equipment, then this talk unfortunately probably won't be suitable. But if you've got a smartphone or a camera, then this talk is for you if you're wanting to get started. So we're going to go through some of the basic equipment that you need, general settings for photography, and the exposure triangle, which is extremely important, and also the different settings for the different types of photographs that you'd want to take. So I am able to see all the comments. I'm seeing loads of guys just coming on board now. That's pretty awesome. Okay, well, let's just talk about getting started. Now, assuming that you already do some kind of photography, what is the difference with daytime photography and nighttime photography? Well, obviously the clue was in the question, in that with nighttime, one of the biggest challenges is being able to see where you're going, and also being able to know what is going to be a good composition for your photograph. Because arguably the most important thing in a photograph is a nice composition. And I would say that in astrophotography, for some reason, it gets overlooked quite often. Too often we just get excited about photographing either just the Milky Way or a star cluster or something like that. But to make your photograph really stand out, you want to try and get some foreground interest. So scouting your location during the day is super important, and especially if you're going off to the countryside, somewhere where you've never been before, and you're really wanting to take the beautiful stars in a dark sky site, then I cannot stress how important it is for your safety as well to ensure that you know where you're going. So scouting your location during the day. Here's an absolutely top tip for you, and that is using apps on your phone can really help you plan your shot. Whether it's the Milky Way shot or the moon rising, or anything that is difficult for you to plan ahead or really know where things are going to come up, then apps like Stellarium is very useful, because you type in, for example, your location, and when you have something called the augmented reality mode, which is where you hold your phone up, and as you move your phone, it overlays what they think you should be able to see at that point. And as you move your phone around, it changes, right? Now, it's so important to point out to you that make sure that that is calibrated, because I see it happen a lot, and I am guilty of it. I'll plan to do, say, maybe a moonrise shot, time-lapse shot, and I'll set my camera up, I'll get my phone app ready, and I'll get the augmented reality app, and the phone wasn't even calibrated. So I'm taking the shots, and all of a sudden, hang on, the moon's rising all the way over to the other side. So just be super aware that you have to calibrate your camera if you're going to use your phone, if you're going to use apps like Stellarium or Sun Surveyor. Now, as I was saying, what's really good about it is the apps give you the ability to fast forward in time. So you just literally tap on it and then you can go, okay, so 3 hours from now, where's the Milky Way going to be? How high is it going to rise up? Where's the moon going to come from? How do I get that shot of the moon rising next to a tree or a castle or, whatever it is? So you can use these apps, and this is the trick, is to point where you think you're looking at, or get it right, and then you can project forward in time and you can see those certain objects. Loads and loads of planning, guys, when it comes to that kind of photography. Now, this is again one of the things that's really overlooked, and that's a tripod. A lot of people don't realize that you've got a camera and you'll take photographs during the day, and because it's plenty brightness, you're used to just using your camera only. But a tripod is so important because you need your camera to be able to see in the dark. And one of the ways we do that is by increasing the time that your camera sensor is open for. It's called opening the shutter to what we call a long exposure photograph. And the challenge with having your camera set at a point where it opens its shutter and takes in more light, the challenge is if there's any movement, holding it by hand or a little bit of wobble or a bit of wind, what's going to happen, guys? Your image is going to be blurry. It's not going to be pin sharp. And so a tripod is absolutely mandatory if you want to get good shots of the night sky. There is no way around it, unless, of course, you're using the ground or a beanbag you can buy or setting it on a wall. But obviously, the tripod, you've got the versatility of angling it and everything else. Now, the thing with tripods is you need it to be not. You don't want to get a cheap one, okay? Because cheap ones, they aren't great at absorbing the vibrations and things. Or it may be that it won't be strong enough to hold your camera at certain angles. So there's no surprise why it's crazy how much you had to end up spending with tripods. It's crazy, right? So my tripod, I have a few tripods, but the tripods that I'm using at the moment were more expensive than my first camera. And my first camera was fairly decent. So, really do invest in these kind of things as if you want to really get into it. This is probably the most complicated slide, and it's not that complicated. It's just a rule that you have to be aware of. As in photography, there's all kinds of rules, right? We have in composition, the thirds rule, we have the focal length rule, and these kind of things. Well, in astrophotography, there's a rule, and it's actually known as a 500 rule. But nowadays, cameras, more and more modern cameras, are designed in a way that actually you have to apply something called the 300 rule. And all this is to understand that, for the folks watching this live, you've probably joined me before on a moon watch. And what we've done is we've had the telescope and iPhone camera looking at the moon, and we can see the moon drifting across the screen. And the reason why this is happening is because the Earth rotates on its axis. So the Earth is moving, and because of that, when we're shooting up in the night sky, in reality, that is a moving object. Okay? So if you have your camera that's static, that faces at one point, what happens is, if your shutter speed is a long enough amount of time, say 20 seconds, 30 seconds, even longer, because the skies are moving due to Earth's rotation, the image is going to be blurry. It's going to be what we have these things called star trails, these little worms. This is how it appears in our photographs. And that obviously isn't what we want, unless you want to do a star trail photo. But what you want is a pinpoint of photograph as possible. Now, assuming right now you're not using a tracking mount. Now, a tracking mount is just like what we use for telescopes. It compensates for the Earth's rotation. If you're not using a tracking mount, you're using a normal tripod, then actually there's a rule that you can apply to work out the longest shutter speed you can have on your photograph before you get these star trails. So I'll repeat that again, it's a bit complicated. There's a way to work out, knowing what focal length you're using of your camera, and by the way, smartphones have focal lengths too, so you can find out what focal length is for your smartphone. And cameras, obviously, depending on what type it is, what lens you use, they all have different focal lengths. And focal lengths basically gives you the ability to have a wide image, so you can, what we call wide lenses, take up more of the landscape, or you can have long focal lengths where you can really start to zoom in. The problem is that the longer the focal length, the shorter the shutter speed can be, because as you're zooming in, the movement of the night skies is amplified simply by the fact that you're zooming in and looking into it further in. So the rule, let's just go for 500 at the moment, and I'll explain back about this 300. The 500 rule works by you get 500 divided by the focal length of your lens. Okay, so if a good lens that you can use, a lot of people use, is a 50mm lens. Now it's called a nifty 50. A 50mm lens is a preferred lens for portraits because we feel our eyes are approximately 50mm. So how we see the world is 50mm. When you start, that number starts to get lower, everything starts to get, it's a wider image. So we see more of the landscape. But a longer focal length, you zoom in more. So let's go with 50mm. So we take the 500 rule, you take 500 divided by a 50mm lens, that equals 10 seconds. Okay, so here we are, I'm just going to point it out with a little cursor here. Using the 500 rule, 500 divided by 50mm equals 10 seconds. Therefore, that means if you're using a 50mm lens, then you could take a photograph of the night sky for a maximum of 10 seconds before you start to get these star trails. If you decide to lengthen the amount of time because you want to try and get in more stars, it ain't going to work. You're going to get these star trails. The thing is, you got to realize is this 50mm on your lens doesn't always mean exactly 50mm, because nowadays there are cameras called crop cameras. Okay, so you'll know if you have a crop camera or full frame camera, but certain cameras now have a smaller sensor. Therefore, there's a multiplier that you have to use to work out your true focal length of your lens. So, for example, if you have a Nikon D3500 or a 750D Canon, these are both crop cameras, and you have to use the 50mm multiplied by either 1.5 for Nikon or 1.6 for Canon. So therefore, using the Canon example, even though you have a 50mm lens, in reality you have an 80mm focal length. So therefore, the sum is 500 divided by 80, and then you get your true amount of seconds that you can go for. I mean, the truth of it is, if I always say, if you use that as a guidance, take the photograph, zoom in, and then see if you're getting star trails. That's probably the best way to do it, using that as a guidance. And more modern cameras with higher resolution, you have to apply a 300 rule. So that's actually even shorter. So my camera is a 45 megapixel camera, and the 500 rule does not work. I have to use the 300 rule. So it's not as good. Just have to do things like increase the ISO settings to get in more light. Okay, so that's the technical side of it out the way. What about getting started? So you've got in your mind where you want to go to take a photograph of, say, the Milky Way or even Northern Lights. Just to let you know, there's a massive aurora alert right now. It's just going through the roof. Aurora was visible last night, and I think it's forecast to be peaking 10 p.m. tonight. But anyway, let's say you're planning to take photographs. You found your location, set up your tripod. This is the first thing you need to do, guys. You need to take your camera off autofocus. Okay, so I hear it all the time. People get their cameras, people get their smartphones, and they go out at night and they want to take a photograph of the stars, but for some reason it's blurry, just won't focus. And that's because with autofocus, your camera is thinking, what am I trying to focus on? Am I trying to focus on that tree? Am I going to try and focus on that bird that just flew past? So what you've got to do is take it off auto, use manual focus. This is so important, guys. So important. Do not skip this part. Hopefully your camera will have a live view setting, which means basically on the back of your camera, you have the ability to see what your camera is seeing at that particular time. And what you can do on most of these cameras is zoom in on what you want to look at, because the screen on the back of cameras are tiny anyway. So what you would normally do is you set your camera up, point your camera at something bright. So either a bright star, maybe there's a street light low on the horizon, but you want to up the ISO, up the shutter time, so that you can definitely get that bright image on your camera. You want to zoom in on it, and then you want to turn the focusing ring so that that object is as sharp as possible. And generally that is as small as possible. Then once you've done that, you know that your camera is focused to what we call infinity. Because what we wanted to do is photograph the night sky. So you know that your camera is focused. And this is so important. And this is like, you need to keep checking this. Whenever I move my camera, change it around, I'm always so aware that I need to make sure everything's sharp. So that's what we've done. The other top tip to give you as well is when you're using a camera on a tripod, you want to take off image stabilization. It's so important as well. Some lenses and even cameras have image stabilization these days, and that just basically helps you when you're taking a photograph with just your hands, what we call handheld photo. But when you're putting a camera on a tripod, you don't need the stabilization, so take it off. Because actually what happens is, if you leave your camera on a tripod with stabilization, you find that the images aren't that sharp because there's a tiny little motor inside and it just keeps it kind of stabilized. So just turn it off. I'm not going to go too in depth with the exposure triangle because it's very much a beginner's photography thing. But I just want to make a little recap for the folks, who obviously do have cameras. The exposure triangle is absolutely the most important thing, right, when you're taking a photograph, because it controls how much light. And as we know, with the night skies, you need to optimize your camera to take in as much light as possible without it affecting things like I said, the star trailing that can occur. So every camera has the ability to alter the ISO settings. The ISO settings is the actual sensitivity of the camera sensor, and it's changed by electricity. In fact, it's the only thing that's non-actual moving parts. It's electricity that you're altering. So obviously the higher the ISO, the more noise that will occur on your photograph. And you will know your camera, you will know the limit of how far you can take your camera in terms of ISO. Obviously, the key is to try and keep it as low as possible. But with my camera, I don't like to go more than 4,000 ISO. I know it can handle more, but I just don't like to go more than 4,000. Your aperture settings are the widening of your camera lens. The wider it is, then the actual opening of the lens, the wider it is, the more light it takes in. So prime lenses, these fixed focal length lenses that you can buy for cameras, the prime lenses ones are best because they generally, in all cases, have a wider aperture than telephoto lenses. So generally, a lot of astrophotographers will use a 20mm nice wide lens, maybe an f1.4. That's quite a good focal length lens that you can use that I would recommend. But I've been playing around with different lenses. I use a 50mm 1.2. I have a 14mm 1.8. So just be aware that your lens that you use obviously has a limitation. This is a really good top tip. So when you release the shutter to take the photograph, what you can do on most cameras is have a timer delay. So, when you want to press a photograph of the stars, the challenge is when you press that photograph, and especially if it's a long exposure photo, then sometimes the movement from pressing the button can have an effect on your image. So the best way to do it is to include a 2-second delay. So you press the button and then it just bleeps, and then 2 seconds later, bam, it takes a photograph. So that's just a really good tip for reducing camera shake, because that's what you want to try and do, is reduce as much camera shake as possible. Smartphone photography, as I was saying, nowadays smartphones are so smart. They use something called computational photography, whereby it's actually the power of the processing which makes photographs so good. So that's what's actually happening. So when you guys have like night mode and things on cameras, what's actually happening is it's stacking the image for you. So it's taking a series of photos and then layering them on to produce a brighter image. So this is stuff that back in the day, forget about smartphone photography, a photographer would have to use software to stack their images to make things brighter. But smartphones now are so clever that they're getting better and better at being able to get good photographs. Now, there are certain apps that you can get for smartphones. I'll talk about that later on, specific for night photography. One of the pros, of course, of smartphones is it's portable, and there is a phrase, and the phrase is the best camera is the one you have with you. People ask all the time, I'm in photography groups, and they say, what's the best camera? What's the best camera? And, it's crazy, right? Because you can't really answer that question as simply as that, because it depends what you want to photograph. And actually, when it comes to things like mirrorlesses and DSLR cameras, the real investment is the lenses. And in some cases, they're just as expensive as the camera themselves. It can be an extremely expensive hobby or even a profession. So the cons of using a smartphone is limited control. Now, what I mean by that is, with a proper camera, if you like, it's very quick to be able to change the settings, ISO settings, aperture settings, and so on. With a smartphone, you would have to look at getting a specific app rather than the native app. Generally, it's changing now. But the biggest cons is not being able to change the lenses on your smartphone. So you can buy, and I literally just to have a bit of fun with it, see if it works. I've bought a huge little telephoto lens for a smartphone. It's crazy, literally like a little mini telescope. So I'm going to give it a go, see what it's like. But the challenge, of course, with smartphones is, they're not the fixed lenses. So the apps I was mentioning, there's an app called Nightcap Camera, which is one that I know Ross recommends. It's a great little. To be honest with you, it sounds ridiculous, but it's a little bit complicated for me right now. I just get on with it and use my camera, but I might really start to give it a go and see what kind of results we can get. And Snapseed is a cool app, and it helps you just edit your photograph. It's similar to something like Lightroom on a desktop. So what about these other cameras? DSLRs, mirrorlesses, bridge cameras. Oh, hang on. Why have I gone backwards? It's a bit weird. So obviously, as I was saying, the best thing about these cameras is the ability to change lenses. Although it can be a con as well. I have so many lenses, it's ridiculous. I'll do a shoot and I'll be using 4 different lenses just to kind of see what kind of results I get. But like I said, full control of settings. And people... I see these comments all the time. Someone says he's got an iPhone. I've got an iPhone 12 Pro, and the photographs it can take are pretty good. During the day, landscape photography, portrait, food photography, and I remember I was in Iceland and I was taking a group of people there, and I was taking photographs of my camera, and there was a gentleman with his iPhone. iPhone 7 or 6 or 7. And he was kicking off. He was like saying, I don't understand, why can't my phone get the results that your camera can? I don't get it. What's going on? And it's interesting because if you consider the fact that a good phone is about £1,000, okay, a good professional DSLR is in the region of £3,000 to £5,000, just the body, and then there's the lens. So a lens can cost up to £3,000, if not more. So you're talking about £8,000 worth of equipment versus a mobile phone that has a very, very good camera. There obviously will be differences. And, I guess that there is just that kind of understanding why results will vary. So just be mindful of that. So what you can do is purchase things called phone adapters, which can attach to your telescope. So as you all know, I do these moon lives, and what's really fun is actually I'm using my telescope as the lens. Remember we were saying that one of the challenges is that mobile phones have fixed lenses. Effectively, what I'm doing with a phone adapter is giving it a new lens, and that new lens is a huge telescope. So in this instance, it's probably one of the only rare occasions where you can change the lenses effectively. Tracking mounts. Now, this is what I was saying earlier on, is that if you get your camera on a static tripod and you photograph a certain part of the sky, and you have the exposure time so long that you start to get these star trails, and the star trails are because of the Earth's rotation. But what you can do is you can buy these star trackers, and you attach your camera and even your smartphone to it, and it compensates for the Earth's rotation. And that basically enables you to take longer photographs and therefore collect more light and see fainter things. So for the folks that are wondering, when you see someone take a photograph of the Milky Way and you're wondering to yourself, how come I can never see that, or the photographs don't look real? There's this sort of kind of confusion. And in all cases with the Milky Way, when it looks really mental, right, and I'll show you some images later, that is because either the person has used a stacking method, but most likely a combination of tracking and stacking. Okay, so these are track and stack. These are the two things that are used a lot in astrophotography. And then finally blending as well. And that's effectively what we call composites. It's when you're combining 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 images, and so on. Okay, now back to the fun bit. So I'm going to show you a series of images that I've taken, and I'm just going to quickly go through with you how the photograph was taken and what kind of settings you would need to be able to get a similar result. Okay, so we're going to start off with just this simple image of a photograph of the night sky with the stars, and this is probably why I would say the most basic photograph to start off with. So obviously we've got a tripod, camera sat on it, I've got manual focusing on, I've got image stabilization off, I've ensured that the camera is focused to infinity. To be able to get this photograph, as you can see, there's a few constellations in there. And so what we've used is a nice wide-angled lens, a lens that can take up show a lot of the night sky or day sky. So a wide-angle lens will help you get as much of the sky as possible. And to take this photograph, I've used a nice wide aperture. So I'm really not wanting to have my shutter time for too long, because generally the longer the shutter time, the more opportunities for things like camera shake, and I think it was fairly windy when I took this photograph as well. So I had my camera lens nice and wide, a medium ISO setting. I didn't want to go too crazy high because you can see there's a bit of light pollution there. And finally, the photograph would have been approximately 3 to 5 seconds. So you have to adapt your settings depending on where you're taking the photograph. If there's loads of light pollution, then you want to consider, taking a series of photographs and then potentially stacking them, or, just changing the settings around and seeing what kind of results you get. So this is a photograph of a shooting star. This was in near Cambridge last year, and what I had to do to take this photograph was not just the photograph itself, but I set the camera on intervalometer settings. So what that means is you can program your camera to take a series of photographs, like clicking every few seconds, so that you're not having to be there and just keep having to press the button yourself, because things like shooting stars, they're very random. You can't time it perfectly. So the only way you can do it is just to get your camera clicking and clicking and clicking away, and hopefully capturing a shooting star in the image. So an intervalometer here is absolutely key. This is the photograph of the International Space Station that I took not so long ago. Now, what did I have to do to take this photograph? Well, I had to zoom in a lot. So I used a 800 millimeter focal length lens. Now, most telephoto lenses, so these are zoom lenses, I would say generally are between 70 to 300. That kind of seems to be, the one that's on the market the most, 70 to 300. Or you can go a little bit more advanced with Canon and go for 100 to 400, and there's Sigma does a 150 to 600. So the 800 mil lens is actually a new line of budget zoom lenses that Canon brought out. And a lot of people were kind of I remember when I saw it, I kind of laughed and thought, this is ridiculous. This is, how can you have a budget 800 mil lens? But actually, I realized that with very high ISO settings, it was very usable. So to get this photograph, I needed to get the image as sharp as possible. Therefore, it was a very fast shutter speed and using a long focal length. So this is a photograph of Comet Neowise. How did we photograph this? Now, the exciting thing is there's a chance there's another comet coming in December. So that's Comet Leonard. And fingers crossed. I mean, I'll keep you all updated with it, when it's happening, where it will be, and obviously all the tips in the world to be able to get some photographs yourself. But for me to get this photograph, it was because the comet stayed up in the sky for a long time. I didn't have to necessarily worry too much about, freaking out and getting the shot as fast as possible. So I was able to take loads of photographs here, took my time, changed the settings, moved things around, changed lenses. But, generally this kind of photograph, you need to consider there's a bit of light pollution. Although it wasn't light pollution, it was just because this is photographed in summer. So in the north here of England, we don't get true night. And so I'm limited by the exposure time and the ISO settings before it's washed out. So a lot of playing around with camera settings to get the comet. Aurora, as I was saying, there is aurora forecast tonight at around 10 o'clock. It's forecast to get very strong. Fingers crossed for clear skies. The only challenge about tonight is the moon is out, so that's not going to help us. But with the aurora changes all the time in strength. And even when you're out and you decide to do what I did, and that was set my camera up at this as soon as I arrived at the location, and then off I went, set the camera and click, and left it alone for 3 hours. This was the biggest lesson I learned. It was a huge mistake because the aurora was weak at the start, and by the middle it got extremely bright, so that my camera, the settings were completely wrong. So just aware with aurora, absolutely need to make sure that the image is nice and sharp, and then depending on how active the aurora is, how much detail you want to reduce the amount of exposure time, because the longer the exposure with aurora, the more there's less structure, and it just seems to blend all into one. So just be really careful with that. This is a really cool image because tonight there's, I would say, a good opportunity to take this kind of photograph. And you may or may not like it, but this is this is kind of like a starburst photo, and some people love it, some people don't. This photograph is the planet Venus appearing to be inside the star cluster, the Pleiades. Obviously, it's quite a dark photograph. You may struggle to see the Pleiades here, but tonight there's an opportunity to photograph the moon with the planet Mars. So the planet Mars and the moon are quite close together in the night sky, and I'm going to be taking this kind of photograph, if it stays clear, where to get a starburst effect, you need to have a very narrow aperture. So your f has to be a high number, f22, f28, f32, if your camera lens will let you, and then I would say a nice fast shutter speed, and a nice medium length focal, something like 200mm, 300mm will be more than adequate to take this kind of photograph. And of course, don't forget, you can always crop in, with images like this. So fingers crossed tonight I'll take a similar photograph of Mars. This is just a photo that's really interesting because it combines both the aurora and the Milky Way. So it's kind of like a hybrid between wanting to get a nice shot of the aurora with some structure, and also the long exposure on the camera to be able to get out the details on the Milky Way. So you have to make a judgment call on going as middle ground as possible. So with this image, however, you can see, it was a fairly long shutter speed, longer than what I would like to use. Again, this was to get the Milky Way details. High ISO was just to try and enable I get a short shutter speed, not too long. Quite an interesting image. So this is the Milky Way by itself, and again, for the folks that follow me a lot, and when I'm talking about the Milky Way is only the galactic core of the Milky Way. So the image here where my cursor is, this part of the Milky Way is only really seen during these particular months. We've got a few days of opportunity left, and then we've got summer, which means that we'll have no true darkness, and then end of August, September, the Milky Way will come back again. So there's only certain times of the year where the galactic core is visible for us in the north of England. Now, this is an interesting shot. This was taken a few nights ago, and this was a 2-shot panoramic photograph. So what you can do is, with software, you can start to combine images together. Now, I'm not talking about stacking, okay, that's a different thing, but this is what I would say a panoramic shot, in that if you have your camera and a lens and you take a photograph of the night sky and it's just not wide enough, you want to get more of the landscape in, more of the night sky in, well, what you can do is you can take a shot, okay, and generally what you would do is have your camera orientation on portrait mode, so kind of like the long ways, and then up and down long ways, and then you take a shot and then you move your camera, you'll twist it slightly to the left but still incorporating some of the original shot, so maybe a third away along, and then take another shot. And you can do that as many times as you want, and what happens is you can put that into certain software like Lightroom or Photoshop and get the software to combine the shots together. It's something that I haven't really done much of, because generally I don't need that much sort of wide landscape because I have quite wide lenses. But in this instance, with a 20mm lens, I just wanted more of the Milky Way. So this is a slightly wider shot than usual. It's a weird format, isn't it? It's not a typical 16:9 or 4:3 or whatever. So this image here is taking what I showed you earlier on, a lot further in terms of info and data. This is actually a 5-shot pano. So this was 5 shots stitched together. And again, it's with the Milky Way, it takes up so much of the sky. This was literally from south to north. So it's almost like 180 degrees of the night sky. And with one lens, it's just no way is it going to fit it all. So I wanted a bit of the landscape as well. So this is how it's the only way you're able to do it. So using these panoramic shots. This is probably one of the most different types of shots, in that This is an image of a long exposure photograph of the International Space Station flying above the Angel of the North. So in order for me to take this photograph, I had to use quite a few different things. The first one was an app that could help me project the path of the space station. So Stellarium, which is an app that I was recommending, helped me project exactly the angle of the space station. And as you can see, it just cleared the left wing of the Angel here, just cleared, and it was moving from this direction over to the over to the rise, over to the east. And anyway, so the challenge was, by the time I got to here, was it going to hit it? Was it going to hit it? And thankfully I missed it. So I had to use an app to help me project the angle. And then I had to take a long exposure photograph because, as you can see, the line isn't broken. It's one long line. But the challenge is, if I took a 3 or 5 minute exposure, which is how long the space station can be in the sky for, guess what? All this light pollution is going to make my photograph completely washed out. So it's just going to be almost a white photo. So this was actually 2 images in one. This is what we call a composite. And I think it's my only ever composite photograph so far. And the idea was I took a photograph of the Angel by itself, and then, or more likely the first frame, and then combine the line of the space station in the image so that it's a composite photograph. Because otherwise, if you're doing a very long photograph like this, your stars are going to be like little worms. It's going to be loads of star trails. I'm going to see if this works. This is a I'm just going to pause for a bit and see if this comes up properly, because I've been having problems with videos. I'm just going to be quiet for a second. Yeah, so I am seeing it as lagging a little bit. It's all right. But this is it's a time lapse, which I've been doing a few of lately with the moon. And this is, again, setting up the camera on intervalometer mode and just letting the camera click away non-stop. Okay, for however long I wanted it to be. So it was approximately 50 minutes, I think. And once the photographs were all done, I then put them all together, and then it can create a little video. So this is like a time-lapse video that anyone can do. So it's just a time-lapse video. It's just a series of photographs that you put together. I'll pick up the pace a little bit. I'm aware of the time. So this is what I was on about earlier on. You ever seen those photographs of the Milky Way? This one here, look, it's just so crazy, isn't it, in terms of the detail and the dark dust lanes and everything else of the galactic core. Now, with your eyes, unless you're in the Atacama Desert or in a Bortle 1 site, then you're really going to struggle to see anything like this. In the UK, you're really going to struggle to see anything like this. Maybe in Wales, you'd see something very, very faint in the outline, but never as vividly bright as this image. And the reason why I was able to take this was using a tracker. So we talked about that earlier on. If we were to take a normal photograph, then the camera will start to get these little star trails. But a tracker will compensate for the Earth's rotation and enable you to take a long, long, long exposure photograph. So this wasn't that long. It was only a minute, but already you can see the difference, in how much more you can see of the Milky Way. And again, this is the same night. It's just slightly different orientation, and it just shows you how you can see so much more of the galactic core. It's a very right now, you'll see loads of images of the galactic core in people's photographs, and they'll have like a structure in front, they'll have people in front, and these are composite photographs. So the only way they can do it is using a tracker and then combining it with a normal photograph. So don't ever get disheartened when you see photographs like this and you're thinking to yourself, how come you can't take photographs like this? Hey Jeff, thank you very much. That's weird. I think I'm just starting to see comments again, as comments stopped for a while, but I think they've started to come back. So anyway, here we have, again, using a tracker. This is very, very basic. There's been no stacking involved, nothing like that. But this is two galaxies, Bode's Galaxy and Cigar Galaxy, and using a tracker and probably a telescope, to be honest with you. I was able to get these images. And again, a tracker will help you get these kind of images as well. This is the globular cluster in Hercules. This is actually my favorite object to look at in the night sky. This was one of my most recent photographs of the Orion Nebula a few months ago. So again, to get these kind of photos, you need a tracking mount. Whether you attach your camera to a tracking mount or you attach your camera to a telescope, which is on a tracking mount. Just be super aware of these kind of limitations. Wow, actually, I did not realize, but that is it.